Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead, it's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Waiver wire, trades, roster management. To win in fantasy football, you must remember one simple rule. Never get out-hustled. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwain McFarland.
Week 12 in the NFL, the fantasy football season is drastically coming to a close. If you're like me in many leagues, you're dying for a victory. You need something big to happen. You got to find a hero on the waiver wire, someone to give you a few points this week. And here at the Fantasy Football Hustle, we're going to help you. We've got the main man, the analytical assassin, establish the runs, Dwain McFarland here. He is going to go team by team with me through the NFL to hit on usage and the utilization of players, and we're going to dip into his utilization report that you can read over at establishtheRun.com, and we're going to see why we should add these guys. Are they playing enough? What are these coaches doing with them? Because, Dwayne, I know there's got to be a lot of guys out there listening, and thanks everybody for tuning in tonight to a special primetime hustle show. I think you get to this point in the season and you kind of zone out a little bit. You're just looking at your guys on your team like, oh my God, why is Tyler Boyd not coming through for me? And maybe you stop seeing the big picture out there. And that's when you can, for lack of a better term, stop hustling and you stop picking up the players that you need to pick up. And that's why we lean on you, my friend, because you're all over every team. And we know exactly that you're going to bring us home a fantasy championship, or at least get us into the playoffs. All right, let's not go too crazy. But how are you, my friend? Welcome.
Man, I'm good. No, I mean, I think you hit everything, right there perfectly. It's the time of the year. Some folks are out of it, and I get it, but I mean, depending on your league setup, if you've got, something that you're still playing for, depending on how many playoff spots there are in your league, or if there's something, where you just don't want to be last place because you don't want to be the guy that has to buy everybody beer next year, or whatever the case, may be. But it's been a crazy season, Drake. So many injuries, and we've talked about this in the past, but to the quarterback position, and even for a guy like me, I write, this utilization article, the column each week for Establish the Run. And, it even affects, me, because I'm being honest here. If I'm looking at some of these receivers, like we'll talk about James Washington in a minute and the opportunity he may have, I'd be a lot more excited if Ben Roethlisberger was still the quarterback. With Mason Rudolph as the quarterback, it's kind of a bummer, but we have that across the league in so many different places, like with Cincinnati right now, they're starting a rookie quarterback, there's stuff going on with their receivers. It's just on and on. Denver, we've got some really cool emerging trends, but Brandon Allen is your quarterback. So it can be it's especially this year, I think, more than any, because usually I don't even find myself being fatigued at this point, of the year. But even I have kind of felt it, just because it's like, oh, you unearth something, but you're like, is it even really worth anything with the quarterback they have? But yeah, we'll help people step through it, and we'll keep context and perspective, obviously, around quarterback situations and things like that as we uncover it. But, there's a lot of injuries to position players and things like that too. And, some of the players we talk about tonight could very well, help someone just get through a week until they get somebody back healthy.
And if you're out of it, your season's not over. You can get back into it, play a little DFS, especially if you want to play a little DFS with Dwayne and I. Thanks to everybody that came out and played with us this week on Fantasy Draft. And you kicked our balls in, if I can be so blunt. Of all the guys in the league, you know who the bottom two finishers were, Dwayne, in this contest?
Us?
Me and you. So everyone's going to go like, why are we listening to these idiots? They can't even win their own stinking DFS tournament. But thank you, guys. We're going to do another tournament this week on Fantasy Draft. Use the promo code FFHustle. Download the Fantasy Draft app. Get in there. It's rake free. They're not taking profits. Anything you put into the system is coming back to you and the other guys in your tournament. Fantasy Draft is really cool. Thanks for being a part of our show. Let's dive right in now. And there's finally some good running back situations, I guess, is a loose term, but there's opportunity on the waiver wire this week. If you've got a little fab money, if you've been holding that number one claim, you've got some opportunities to cash in today. All right, let's start with the Colts, Dwayne. Marlon Mack injures his hand. They have a Thursday night game, so you folks, you got to be on the ball here. So Jonathan Williams, you might remember him from a few years ago in Buffalo, and then they cut him when he was supposed to have a role. He slides in 13 rushes for 116 yards, even caught a pass. But Dwayne, it's not only him. You've got Jordan Wilkins, who might be back. You've got Nyheim Hines, who's kind of their passing down back. Give me your thoughts on this Colts backfield and what is it worth in the terms of a fab pickup?
Yeah, on Monday, Frank Reich actually said that Jonathan Williams and Jordan Wilkins will be splitting the work from Marlon Mack, and it sounds like Nyheim Hines will still be in his same role. So unfortunately, we don't really know. They could ride the hot hand. Jonathan Williams did good enough though that I had been holding Jordan Wilkins actually in several different leagues, Drake, just because I like the offensive line for the Colts so much.
Absolutely.
And then the 1 week the guy is out with an ankle when he could have claimed this role and been the guy, Jonathan Williams is in there and shows out well enough that it probably will be a split or they'll be riding the hot hand. The matchups coming up for Indianapolis aren't the worst. Like Houston's not a bad matchup. That's a plus matchup. But then you get Tennessee. It's a neutral matchup. Then you get Tampa Bay, which is a negative matchup. I'm guessing you're at least going to see this tandem for the next 3 weeks. What I would say is I would try to pick up, one of these guys if I can, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't necessarily be counting on it to save my season. But if you're in a really rough spot, and you need a runner, I would still lean to Jordan Wilkins. But part of that is just because he's a guy that I liked when he came out of college from Mississippi State. I like his style as a runner. He's a guy that they've been trying to work in all year. So he's the guy that, and I think, he's also really good as a receiver out of the backfield. So Wilkins would still be the guy that I would go after first, but Jonathan Williams is a guy that, people have given love to for a while. And like you said, as soon as Mack went out, it really was Jonathan Williams. He took on 44% of the snaps. Mack played 32%. He took 37% of the rushing attempts after Mack left, after Mack had 40% up until then. So it was really all Jonathan Williams' show. Nyheim Hines only had 9% of the attempts. And like you said, he did work into the passing game a little bit, 34% routes per dropback. He had 4% of the targets, nothing huge there. He also had a run inside of the 5-yard line. So 16 PPR points, that's better than Marlon Mack could put up in either of the 2 previous weeks. Of course, Mack already had 17 PPR points in this game, but it is a really good offensive line. I would still lean towards Jordan Wilkins as being, the guy that I would want to own here out of the 2.
Deep PPR league, do you put a couple of bucks on Hines?
I mean, if you're really in a pinch, we're really in the last week, so if it's like do or die for you and you've got to have someone, I guess.
You can't count on him. You're going to end up with 5 points.
Yeah, I think he's an absolute worst case scenario guy. He's just if I thought he was going to pick up some of these carries, that would be different, but he's not. They're going to let Williams and Wilkins have these. So it's just a tough situation, Drake. I love this line, but look at what Marlon Mack had been doing, really getting all the work. Here are his points: 20 in a full point PPR, 23, 8, 17, 4, 18, 9, 16, 9, 9, 17. So now you got to split that. So it's nothing to be super excited about, to be honest.
Jordan Wilkins is a name that I think if you're not in a super savvy league, people are going to kind of sleep on, and they're all just going to go to the hot, what have you done for me lately name and Jonathan Williams. So I think Wilkins is a guy you're going to be able to get if you're maybe a little farther down the pecking order in terms of first come, first serve. So just, good luck tonight. Let's move on, Dwayne, over to Detroit, where the Lions have this 3-headed backfield now. I was going to start J.D. McKissick this weekend in a pinch. And then all of a sudden, here comes Bo Scarborough from Alabama, a guy you and I actually drafted in a dynasty league over the summer. I don't know if you remember that. I think he was a 7th rounder. He got cut by the Cowboys, and now here he comes for the Lions, comes in, takes 14 of their 19 rushing attempts, and he gets the Redskins this week. Bo Scarborough, is he kind of the guy to pick up this week?
Well, we have seen already that, Trey Carson, Detroit wants to use a bigger back if they can. Remember a few weeks back, they had picked up Trey Carson from Green Bay. He came over and played 61% of the snaps in week 9, took 45% of the rushing attempts, while Ty Johnson only took on, or J.D. McKissick took 20%. We know that, Trey Carson is a bigger back. He was the guy they wanted to use. And so now it's Bo Scarborough. And so honestly, sorry, I think I got that wrong. It was week 8, where Trey Carson came in and actually led the team in the rushing attempts. It was week 9 where Ty Johnson did. But anyway, they've shown that they would rather use that back, and now Bo Scarborough is that guy. So as long as the Lions are in a game that's within a score, or if they're in a game where they're leading, I think Scarborough will be the guy that they lean on. If they get in a situation where they're heavily trailing, then I think he's not going to see the field, right? Then I think it's McKissick and Ty Johnson because they've got better chops as receivers. Scarborough didn't see a target this past weekend. It wasn't terrible. I mean, he did run a route on 21% of the dropbacks versus 26% for J.D. McKissick, 38% for Ty Johnson. He did get a carry inside the 5-yard line, which that was really good. He was the only guy to get one of those. He actually had another that was called back by penalty. So Scarborough, he's a guy that I would rather own him, I think, right now than, have to deal probably with the Jonathan Williams splitting,
Yeah.
It's really, I mean, obviously it's tough to say. I mean, if you look at Detroit, I just like the matchup this weekend. I feel like it's a game where Detroit should be winning, or it should be at least close. I haven't read the latest on Matt Stafford for this week. I was looking at injury stuff earlier, but I didn't see anything on Stafford. Obviously, if Stafford were to play, that would be big because I would expect Detroit to be leading, by double-digit touchdowns by the end of the game or by double-digit points. That would really be a good situation for Scarborough to close out a game and hopefully get you a touchdown, maybe 70, 75 yards.
Driscoll hasn't been as abysmal as I thought he was going to be for Detroit.
Yeah, he's not very good, but what he's good at is he's good at escaping pressure. Obviously, I watched every snap of that game this weekend because I'm a Cowboys fan. He wasn't hitting any of his first reads, second reads, third reads, but he's just elusive enough to buy time in the pocket and then make that throw late. He also did some nice things on the read option, which helped open up some of the running game for both Scarborough and the other running backs. In fact, the touchdown that Scarborough scored on was actually a read option. They had given some read option variations with the quarterback earlier in the game, and then that froze Leighton Vander Esch, on that specific play. So, yeah, I mean, it's not terrible. You'd rather it be Matt Stafford, but it is what it is. So Scarborough, yeah, if you're in a pinch, I mean, he had 50% of the attempts, this weekend. So I think he's the guy that as long as they're not getting blown out, he's going to see the majority, of the work.
All right. These next few situations, the guys could be owned, but if you're owning these guys, you may be frustrated. You might not know what to do. So let's get Dwayne's advice on it. In Arizona, if Kenyan Drake is somehow available, add him immediately. He should be the priority add, in my opinion. David Johnson just really needs to be shut down. Chase Edmonds hasn't returned yet. They're on bye this week, so just a heads up. Anything quickly on Arizona?
I mean, I think you pretty much covered it. I think just the surprising thing is 90% of the snaps this last week after David Johnson wasn't on the injury report. David Johnson only played 12% of the snaps, 0% of the rushing attempts, ran a route on 8% of the dropbacks. I mean, clearly they just went to Kenyan Drake. And it might just have to do with health, but right now at this point in the season, Drake is the guy that has more of the juice. His targets the last 3 weeks, 17%, 14%, 21%. I mean, it's seeing the rushing attempts of 65, 56, 64%. He's a viable option, in this offense. Yeah, I don't know exactly what's going to happen when Chase Edmonds comes back. And after bye week, maybe David Johnson's healthier. There's still the risk of a 3-way committee here, Brian. But if I were to own a back in Arizona and you made me pick and say, which one do I want to own for the rest of the year? It would be Kenyan Drake.
For sure. I'm a Nick Chubb owner. I'm not upset because he's getting carries. The last 2 games, he has 47 rushing attempts and 5 targets. 4 of those targets were 2 games ago. But he's not getting the looks in the passing game. Nick Chubb is getting, his lunch eaten in the passing game by Kareem Hunt. And if Hunt's on the waiver wire and you're in a PPR league, you can start this guy. No question about it. He's getting enough run on this Cleveland team where he's viable. Thoughts on Chubb and then Kareem Hunt in terms of a flex in a PPR?
I mean, really for Chubb, like if you look at the targets from a percentage standpoint, he's here they are for the season: 11, 11, 17, 13, 4, 14, 3, 12, and here are the last 2 weeks, 8 and 3. So it's really not that far off from where he's been. He's never been a guy that's getting, the 20%, like some of the other elite runners in the league, like McCaffrey and Kamara. He's not seeing those. He's never seen those kind of looks. So he's still hovering, he's going to hover around the 7 to 8%. He had been around the 10 to 12. So it's not that huge of a deal. What's important is they're getting them both on the field together. We talked about that last week. If you look at this week, 73% of the snaps versus 81% the week before for Nick Chubb, and Kareem Hunt 55% and 54%. So it's not hurting Chubb as far as being on the field, which that's important, because he's out there to get the rushing attempts. Each of the last 2 weeks, 77% of the team's rushing attempts have gone through Chubb. Kareem Hunt has had 15% and 17%. But to your point, Kareem Hunt's really the third option in the passing game now, 24% and 22% of the targets, which is tied for second on the team the last 2 weeks with Jarvis Landry. Odell Beckham Jr., has been just getting peppered 32% and 31% over the last 2 weeks, and finally seeing some targets also in the end zone. He's up to 6 now on the season, 25% of the team's looks. But yeah, Kareem Hunt is a guy that you can definitely put into a flex spot because, 20% of the targets, at runner, and he's 22% is low so far. He is a guy that, in a pinch, he could end up giving you, between, just like he has the last, especially in PPR, he's going to be somewhere between 10 and 15 points. And if he scores a touchdown, on top of that, it could be worth even more.
Nick Chubb owners, rest easy this week. They're at home against the Dolphins. He should be able to fall into the end zone, you'd hope, and maybe propel
he should score. He really should score multiple touchdowns this weekend. I mean,
from your lips to God's ears.
It'll surprise me if Nick Chubb doesn't have 2 touchdowns this weekend against the Dolphins.
All right, so it didn't look great, but if you look at the efficiency, not the efficiency, just the numbers in general, let's look at Miles Sanders and what he did in a backfield without Jordan Howard. 11 carries, 4 targets. I don't get why Boston Scott was in the mix so much, maybe just to give Sanders a break. Jay Ajayi was re-signed, didn't see the field. We'll talk about him in a moment, but give me your thoughts on Miles Sanders this week. I thought from, the situation he was in, I thought he played well.
It wasn't a great matchup. You're playing against the Patriots. Mm-hmm. And Miles Sanders, like we've talked about, he's gotten better, but he still struggles to see what's in front of him to make the right decisions as a runner. And against a team like the Patriots, you just, you can't do that. They're going to make you pay for that. But I thought he did fine. I didn't expect a lot out of him. It was only 7 PPR points, but it really was a tough matchup. Played 85% of the snaps, took on 52% of the carries. He had a route ran on 77% of the dropbacks. I was surprised he only saw 10% of the targets, to be honest. I was thinking with Alshon Jeffrey out and the coverage that the Patriots could put out there on Jordan Matthews and Nelson Aguilar, and I figured they would probably be trying to bracket Ertz. I really thought Miles Sanders could probably, I thought maybe 20, 25% of the targets could come his way, but that just didn't come to pass. As far as Boston Scott goes, I think that's just, again, proof that Doug Peterson, no matter what, he can't help it. He's got to use, multiple runners, Drake. He can't stand it. He can't stand to not do it. So, yeah, I think for Miles Sanders, the key is we just got to see what's going to happen with Jordan Howard, this next week. I was kind of surprised, to be honest. He must have really been hurt because they came out of a bye week, and he was limited all week.
They were more injured coming out than they were going in.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with Jordan Howard. But, as far as Philadelphia goes, you get a neutral matchup this week against Seattle, and then the next week you get Miami. So if for some reason Miles Sanders, is the only guy coming up here, this weekend and the next week and even the weekend after, they get the Giants and then the Redskins. I mean, Philly, owning the Philly runners through the playoffs is not going to be a bad thing. You get Miami, New York, and Washington.
I'm obviously, if you guys have listened to the show, I am a huge Philadelphia fan. I texted Dwayne earlier in the week and I go, I don't know if I'm more sad for my real life team or my fantasy team that I just added Jay Ajayi. Now, here's my thoughts on Ajayi. I don't think he's going to be playable maybe this week. To me, though, there's a reason you bring in Jay Ajayi. You could have easily elevated D'Angelo Henderson from the practice squad. Okay, he's down there. You could have added him, or maybe just try to go through the game with the 2 backs. Darren Sproles goes to IR. Jordan Howard is banged up, and I wonder how banged up he really is, Dwayne, because Jay Ajayi is not a replacement for Darren Sproles. He's a replacement for that power running game in Jordan Howard. So if you're bringing this guy into the roster, I mean, it wouldn't shock me. You see another week DNP, and then, the ball gets turning, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, the guy gets put on IR. we've seen those crazy things happen, but
especially late in the season, you've seen it happen. Philly, is in the playoff hunt. So I think it would take a lot for them to want to shunt Jordan Howard down. A lot of those teams you see that do that, they're just out of it. But it wouldn't surprise me, and I do totally agree with your logic, that he is the replacement for Howard. That's that's the role Ajayi would fill. And there's room for 3 backs in this backfield. We've seen it before. If he's practicing well, he could carve out a role. It's not necessarily that you're going to want to be starting him if there's 3 guys, but it's worth owning because anytime one of them goes down, the Eagles' offensive line is so good, and the schedule we just talked about is so good. If you're in a super deep league, owning and stashing Jay Ajayi, especially if you're the Jordan Howard owner, is not a bad idea.
Yeah. All right. In Miami, Mark Walton's cut. If you read the reasons why, he's a complete scumbag. So we'll let that pass. So he was suspended anyways. He's out. Kalen Ballage put up a ridiculous Herculean 9 yards on 9 attempts this past weekend. I'm wondering, Dwayne, at some point, does Patrick Laird, who went 6 for 51 as a receiver, does he or someone else get a shot in this backfield?
I mean, we'll see. You've got Laird, you got Gaskin. Ballage has been really bad. But I feel like at this point, Miami just wants to see what they have in him. I don't think it's like they're trying to win games. You know what I mean? 82% of the snaps, 77% of the snaps over the last 2 weeks. Rushing attempts, 77 and 69%. Routes per dropback, 64 and 46%. Targets, 12% and 13%. So it's not like you really want to start it. I don't really want to own any of this, but if I had to start somebody in a pinch from Miami, it would totally be Kalen Ballage. I think he's the only guy right now that is going to get the volume, even though we know he's very inefficient. A decent matchup this weekend versus Cleveland. Then he gets a tough matchup against Philadelphia, but then he gets 2+ matchups, the Jets and the Giants, and then the Bengals in your week 16, which many of you are playing your championship in if you haven't already finished it up in week 15. So the schedule is not terrible, but it is the Dolphins. Again, not a top-notch guy, but a name that we at least have to cover because he is getting snaps. By far, he's the top guy in the depth chart.
In Denver, Royce Freeman, it almost looks like he's kind of being phased out, where Phillip Lindsay is getting the majority of the rushes. And what's killing these guys with Brandon Allen at quarterback is they're no longer getting the targets, Dwayne. I heard a stat earlier this week where at one point those two combined for like 25% of the Broncos' targets. And now with Brandon Allen, they're down to like 8. So they're just not getting the ball checked down to them, which sucks a lot of value away from a guy like Lindsay. But are you seeing that Lindsay's kind of just taken over that backfield and it's more of a one-man show?
It's not completely a one-man, but it's definitely more of an A and a B. It used to be a 1A and a 1B, really them sharing, or really they were both Bs, I guess they were both 2s, a 2A and a 2B because they were splitting everything. Now Lindsay truly, this last week, his snaps jumped from 48% to 65%. And it's also paired with the fact that there were reports Sunday morning out of Denver saying that the team really wanted to move more to Phillip Lindsay and to give him more opportunity because of his big playability, et cetera, et cetera. And then it did play out. So it's not like we just all of a sudden saw a bump in snaps. And then because sometimes you don't know, maybe Royce Freeman may have tweaked an ankle and we didn't know it, right? That kind of thing. That stuff happens all the time in the league that we don't even hear about. And they don't even show up on an injury report the next week sometimes. But in this case, we heard that the coaching staff had decided they wanted to get the ball to Lindsay more, and then we saw it play out in the game. So this is something that I would expect to see continue. His rushing attempts weren't that much different than normal. Lindsay took on 48%. He's at 51% for the season, but Royce Freeman's have been down the last 2 weeks, 25% and 24% of the rushing attempts, where he had been at 48 and 43 the 2 weeks before. So some of the rushing is now going to Brandon Allen via run. The quarterback is taking off. So Lindsay, though, I do think he is the clear lead rusher. And he's also the leading guy as far as the routes per dropback, 55% this last week, whereas that had been the role that really Freeman had owned, Drake. So before that, if you looked at 6 out of the last 9 games, Freeman had been over 50% routes per dropback. And now that for the first time this season, he dropped down to 29%. That was by far his lowest of the season, and Lindsay was up at 55%. So yeah, I think Phillip Lindsay, again, we're talking about another offense that lost its quarterback, hasn't been very good. So It's like, what is it really worth? It's still tough, but a guy like Lindsay that is explosive as he is, getting more touches is never a bad thing. So I think he's a guy that he definitely deserves more consideration in starting lineups over the next couple of weeks.
Hopefully, guys, you're following us all on Twitter. Follow the show at FF Hustle. I'm at Drake Fantasy, and you all know the great Dwain McFarland. He is at Dwain McFarland. Spell it DWAIN McFarland. What are you up to now? Like 58,000 followers or something? What do you got?
I don't know. It's 12 something.
That's amazing, man. Good for you. And then, of course, we do have our YouTube channel. Hopefully some of you are checking us out there. And on Facebook, search us out at Fantasy Football Hustle Podcast. I always see a few of you liking us as the weeks go by, so that's really cool. We appreciate that. We are the only fantasy show without hats. That's going to be like kind of our new slogan going forward. I'm really digging that. I know a lot of you watch fantasy football podcasts, and we've now jumped into this video form. I don't think there's another show, Dwayne, in America that doesn't wear hats. Neither of the hosts. So that's kind of our new thing now. The show without hats.
We'll never wear a hat. You've worn a hat like one time, I think.
I've got terrible hair. My dad is fully bald, and I'm holding on. I'm still doing okay. This lighting here doesn't do anything for me in my basement, but
as you can see, my family has very freaking thick hair.
Yeah, seriously. I'll be 40 this year, so I'm okay. I'm good enough. I've got an array of Eagles hats that I can wear. All right, the last running team we're going to talk about here before we switch over to the wide receivers, and it'll be the same team. What the hell happened to San Francisco, Dwayne? So Raheem Mostert comes in. He splits snaps with Coleman. Neither of them do jack. I start Mostert. I see a backup running back catch a screen pass and go into the end zone. I go, yeah, there we go. It's Jeff freaking Wilson. One play he played. One play, Dwayne. And not to steal your snap thunder, but no, one play for Jeff Wilson.
1%. Hey, you said the play. I'll say the percentage. 1%. And yeah, he scores. It's funny. Jeff Wilson and his 10 points.
Awful.
Yeah.
If Breed is not there to screw me, it's the next guy.
Yeah. And if you look at it, from a percentages standpoint, Coleman really did dominate. He played 63. He took 63% of the rushing attempts. 32% went to Raheem Mostert, 0%, right, to Jeff Wilson. Like you said, it was a screenplay that he caught. Coleman got another look inside the 5, brings him up to 7 on the year. So, it's a game where we really would have thought Coleman would have done more. And really, if you look at his underlying utilization with Matt Breida out, it was good enough that normally in this offense, you're going to get points out of that. He scored 9 points last week, but I would still bet on Coleman scoring 15 to 20 points if he gets this kind of workload again, if Matt Breida misses. So overall, I'm still encouraged by, if we have Breida out, you should still feel comfortable with Coleman. As far as Mostert goes, he did split the snaps, but only 30% of the rushing attempts. Which really, he just took on, I say only, he took on Matt Breida's role. The week before, Breida had taken on 37% of the rushing attempts. So if you're in a pinch, Mostert's a guy that you can use. I don't even have their schedule up in front of me right now, Drake. So we've got Green Bay. Green Bay is a good one.
Yeah, it's going to lead into Deebo Samuel because his schedule at corner going up against him is not great.
But from a running perspective, you got a good matchup this week in Green Bay with Tevin Coleman and even Mostert. If Breida's out, I would feel pretty good about that if I needed to. But yeah, let's talk some Deebo Samuel. What do you got?
How about Deebo, though? 10 targets, 8 for 134. If he's on your waiver wire, folks, and you need a plug-and-play wide receiver, it doesn't get more appetizing than Mr. Samuel. This rookie's really come into play in a half-point PPR the last 2 weeks, 15.2 and 17.4. But he's going to run into Jair Alexander. Then he runs into the Ravens on the road. Then you get Marcus Lattimore and the Saints. Okay, you get a reprieve with the Falcons in week 15, but they're playing inspired football right now. Oh, and then you get Jalen Ramsey in the fantasy Super Bowl. So who knows? Maybe he could overcome that tough schedule, but if you need a guy, he's going to get targets, and there he is.
Yeah, they're moving him around. So he's seen 35%, 20%, and 33% from the slot. They're trying to do some things with him. But yeah, here's what I see with him. Emmanuel Sanders has got a rib issue. It's cartilage. So that's something that could take a few weeks to get over. And it's also a thing that on any hit, right, Sanders could just be knocked out of a game.
Absolutely.
But really, I think what would be better for Deebo going forward from here, Drake, would be if Kittle and Sanders are healthy, because of what you just said about the corners. Because if Emmanuel Sanders is healthy and he's out there, I would expect the top corner from those teams to probably go with Emmanuel Sanders. And that would open Deebo up to be the guy playing on the next best corner on the team, which isn't great against Baltimore because now they've got
85 good corners.
Yeah, they've got 85, first team all pro corners. And so, they're difficult. Lattimore, though, if you get to play, in the slot more, you get to play against Williams and some of the other guys that you get matchups with. As far as the Saints, those can be good matchups. So really for Samuel, what we want to see is for Sanders and Kittle to get better, because I think he's locked himself into his snaps and his routes per drop back. I think even when you see Emmanuel Sanders come back, I think you're going to see Deebo Samuel's routes per drop back stay in the 80% range, just because, he stepped up and performed. And that's what Kyle Shanahan's been looking for all season is, hey, somebody please step up and take this thing. And since Emmanuel Sanders has arrived, Deebo Samuel has really stepped up his game.
If you go over to establishtheRun.com, and of course, why aren't you folks, you'll read the utilization report from Dwain McFarland. One of the guys he mentions in that article is a gentleman we talked about a week ago, and I dare say there aren't 5 other podcasts in America a week ago that were talking about Marcus Johnson from the Indianapolis Colts, and he makes the article this week, Dwayne. I
know. He went from us not knowing his name hardly to now he's in an article on Establish the Run. Way to go, Marcus Johnson. You've arrived.
There you go. I'm not even in an article on Establish the Run. This guy's beating me. So let's talk about this receiving core here. So it looks like T.Y. Hilton's close to returning. Devin Funchess is going to be coming off the IR. Eric Ebron missed time. They play Thursday. Who knows if he plays or not. But let's assume none of those guys play this week. Marcus Johnson, with the season on the line in fantasy, Dwayne, can you plug this guy in?
You better be in a super freaking deep league. I mean, the good thing is you've got a divisional matchup against Houston, so there could be some points, going around in the game.
Yeah.
But it's still tough. I mean, this is really, he played 92% of the snaps. He ran a route on 97% of the dropbacks.
Wow.
Pascal has been at 100% the last 2 weeks. Pascal has had 16, 18, and 25% of the targets, and Johnson has jumped from 8 to 17%. So, it's not a real robust passing game. I'm not a big Jacoby Brissett fan. It's a functional offense, but that's about all the accolades I can give to it. But hey, if you're in a super deep league, or if you're looking for a punt play potentially, in DFS, Johnson's a guy to keep in mind. Unless if T.Y. Hilton's going to be back, that would obviously be problematic, for Johnson. I think that pushes him down to 4th because really Chester Rogers is the guy they like to work out of the slot. But when they're in 2 wide receivers, it's been Pascal and Johnson over the last 2 weeks. He has two targets in the end zone over the last 2 weeks too, Drake.
I'm looking him up right now. He is $6,000 on Fantasy Draft. So if you're going to play over there this week, he is dirt cheap. And we do hope you guys come and join us on Fantasy Draft. Use promo code FFHustle. Dwayne and I will be tweeting the link out when the weekend comes around. And we're so happy that a lot of you guys have jumped in and got on Fantasy Draft. It's a new platform. They're growing. They're excited to be a part of the show. We're super excited to have them here, that they trust in us, that our listeners are going to go out and play in things like this. And you guys have come through. So we're really thankful. Go play some rake-free DFS at Fantasy Draft. Use promo code FFHustle. Tell them that Drake and Dwayne sent you, and you're going to kick our asses because apparently that's what our listeners do if you played with us this week. So let's keep rolling at the wide receiver position, Dwayne. Sterling Shepard may return this week for the Giants. So now we've got Sterling Shepard coming back. We've got Darius Slayton before the bye that had that huge week. A lot to be excited about if you're streaming Daniel Jones, I guess, for the Giants, and they play the Bears this week on the road. If you're checking that waiver wire, people may have dropped Sterling Shepard because he's been hurt for so long. Between Shepard and Slayton, which would you rather own going forward?
I would still rather own Slayton. I'm just worried about, the concussion thing with Shepard. Just, it scares me.
Sure.
And I think Slayton gives them something that honestly they need. They need a vertical presence on the field. And, we talked about this back when the season started, Drake. We talked about really, how's this going to work with Sterling Shepard and Golden Tate? I mean, these guys all do the same thing.
Yeah, they have 25 slot receivers.
Yeah, Slayton actually gives them a vertical element to their passing game. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm thinking too rationally, but if I were their coaching staff, to me, it makes the most sense to have the guy that can give you something different and make defenses give you respect and create cushion for and create space for the rest of your offense. Of course, knowing the way that offense works, it's a horizontal, not a vertical offense. So it probably, to be honest, it's probably Sterling Shepard still the guy to own, even though like me thinking, strategically about football, I would much rather have a guy like Slayton out there. It's not that I don't like Sterling Shepard, but he just gives me more of the same thing that I already have. I mean, now they're going to play a lot of 11 personnel, so there's room for all three guys, to get on the field. But if I'm talking about my normal wide receiver sets where I'm in two wide receivers, and even in my heavy formations, I think Slayton is the guy that demands, the most respect from, the safeties and corners.
Tyreek Hill is going to have an MRI. He hurt his hamstring. We'll see what comes out of that. They're on bye this week. Cardinals, Chiefs, Chargers, Vikings. Those are the four teams on bye. Let's say Tyreek Hill has to miss some time, and I've already seen it in some leagues I play in, Dwayne. Mecole Hardman gets dropped. Demarcus Robinson gets dropped. Sammy Watkins gets dropped. Where are you going in this passing game of the Kansas City Chiefs? Because if you're attached to Patrick Mahomes, you're valuable in fantasy. Yeah,
I mean, Watkins is still the guy. What's funny is Watkins is just when Tyreek Hill isn't playing, Watkins just hasn't been very good this season. But Mecole Hardman, what's interesting is early in the season when we had injuries to Sammy Watkins and Tyreek Hill, Mecole Hardman was still playing, third and fourth fiddle. He was a guy they would work in. He was getting more playing time than he had when everyone was healthy. And that, whenever everybody's healthy, he sees, 20, 30%, right, of playing time. But then we saw it creep up into the 50, 60% range when injuries hit. Well, this past weekend, when Tyreek Hill left, Mecole Hardman was actually the next guy. So it was Sammy Watkins at 82% of the snaps, and then Mecole Hardman at 76%, Demarcus Robinson only at 57%. So Mecole Hardman, if you want to look at routes ran per dropback, Drake was actually the lead on the team. 86%, and you do, 84% to Sammy Watkins, 73% to Demarcus Robinson, obviously 100% to Travis Kelce in that particular scenario. But Hardman was the guy. So to really, they tried to use him more than they had in the past. So I'm anticipating now that while before everybody jumped on Mecole Hardman and it was really Demarcus Robinson and some of the other guys getting it, I think that maybe he's grown to the point to where they're going to try and make him really do more of what Tyreek Hill does. Now, will he be able to stand up to that test? Probably not fully, because Tyreek Hill's a special player. Mecole Hardman is still, he's still learning how to be a receiver. He's only been a receiver for like 2 years. He was converted from a defensive back in college. So he's a guy that's still learning the craft. But
he's
this last week,
fast.
Yeah, it's a vote of confidence, in my opinion, for him to see that many snaps and that many routes per drop back when we didn't see that before.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm a fan. I couldn't believe when I saw a couple of guys drop him in different leagues. The Patriots unveiled N'Keal Harry for the 2019 season and got on the field, almost played 50% of the snaps. We had Mohamed Sanu get hurt. We had a concussion to Philip Dorsett. And we had a guy on Instagram today, Dwayne, apologizing to the Patriots and a bunch of Patriots players liking the post. And it just makes you wonder, could Antonio Brown be coming back to the Patriots? But who knows? So anyways, N'Keal Harry and this passing game, what are your thoughts as they played probably the best secondary ever to play in the NFL in the Philadelphia Eagles?
That's what's scary, right? Is how did
they played well. That was the best defense the Eagles played all year.
Yeah, and the Patriots receivers, they're just blah. Edelman's a great slot receiver, but it's like they're really struggling. They started off so hot, to begin the season, and they've just really faded as they've played better competition. But yeah, as you mentioned, Mohamed Sanu, it looked like he hurt his ankle, towards the end of the second quarter. You were watching the game, so you could probably speak to it better than me. But yeah, he ended up only playing 55% of the snaps. We know Philip Dorsett left with a concussion, so he only played 46%. So that left room for N'Keal Harry to get involved, and a little bit for Jacoby Myers, but it was Harry to be the guy that really got involved more. He saw 43% of the snaps as opposed to 26% for Myers, 42% routes per dropback for Harry. Only saw 4% of the targets, but he seems to be the guy that if both of those guys were to miss time, he'll be in the mix for one of the 3 wide receiver spots. Jakobi Meyers would probably also be in the mix to work in with Julian Edelman. So we'll see. I mean, New England, if you're looking at their schedule, versus what they had early in the season, it's tougher, but it's really not bad from a secondary standpoint. Dallas is a plus matchup. It's a plus 2.8 in a PPR setup. Then you get Houston, and then you get Kansas City, which is a plus 4.1, and then Cincinnati, which is a plus 5.2. So if for some reason N'Keal Harry were to see more playing time, whether it's due to injury or due to his role growing, there are some good matchups on the horizon for the New England Patriots, passing offense. My guess will be Sanu is not dealing with anything long-term. Concussions can be tricky, so we'll have to see with Dorsett. I can't remember, Drake, if Dorsett has had a concussion before. I want to say he has, but I don't think he's had one this season. He was hurt with something else earlier in the season. I don't know. I can't remember if it was a hamstring or what it was. But not something I'm super excited about, again, unless I'm in a super deep league. If we're talking like your normal leagues where, you're in a 10-man or an 8-man league, N'Keal Harry, unless you got a super deep bench, N'Keal Harry is not somebody that you're going to be able to depend on, not somebody you're going to be rushing out to pick up.
Let's go to your hometown Cowboys here, because Randall Cobb is playing like someone who belongs in fantasy lineups. 4 of 7 on his targets, 115 yards and a touchdown. We've got Amari Cooper limping all over the field. So now in the past few weeks, he's put up 106 yards in a score, and this week 115 in a score. If Amari Cooper is as hurt as he kind of looks out there, boy, Randall Cobb deserves to be on your team and in consideration for a flex spot.
Yeah, the key is, Dallas is dropping back to pass 59% of their plays over the last 2 weeks, 68 and 69%. And if you really look at the way that they're operating their offense, Drake, they're getting 66 plays a game, which is 6th best in the league. So Kellen Moore has brought up-tempo offense to the team. They are throwing the ball a little bit more than they did last year. And so what that's doing with Dak playing so well, that's really, that's the tide that rises all ships, right? So you're getting more plays, and you've got you've got a quarterback that's improved. And, Michael Gallup also had a great weekend too. He scored 11, 18, and 24 PPR points over the last 3 weeks. Cobb 10, 23, 22. And it's just because, the team is playing so well and they're playing with good tempo. So when you really look at, and that's why, I put this team context in my utilization reports that I put out on Twitter, and it shows how many plays per minute, margin of victory. It shows the percentage of dropbacks for the team, because those things all matter. If you're just looking at routes ran per dropback, there's a difference between teams that run a lot of plays that have good quarterback play versus teams that run a low amount of plays and have a bad quarterback, like the Pittsburgh Steelers. If you look at the Steelers, you can look at a receiver on that team and say, well, he's running 90% of the routes per dropback, but they run the lowest amount of plays, or the second lowest amount of plays in the league. And they have a bottom 8 quarterback right now because they've got a young guy still trying to figure things out. But with Dallas, it's just that Dak's playing so good, and they've really moved more to a pass first, philosophy, and that's why, you're just not seeing these huge games as far as volume for Zeke. It's still good from a percentage standpoint, but his overall carries and touches are down because they're getting the ball to these other guys. If you look at Cooper, if you look at, Randall Cobb, he only ran a route on 69% of the dropbacks, Drake. His targets only 20%, 17%, and 15%. But again, it's in an offense with a really good quarterback, or a quarterback that's playing really well, and they're running a lot of plays. And their defense is struggling this year. Their defense was really good last year. This year, Dallas's defense really doesn't seem to be able to stop anybody. If you look at Detroit playing with a backup quarterback, and it was a game that lasted all the way right down to the end. So the offense is having to keep the gas pedal down to the floor, and that's helping guys like Randall Cobb. And a week, what will happen is, if you run into a week where Dallas is held down, or Dallas doesn't need to score a lot of points, that's going to be the week where it's going to really hurt you with Randall Cobb. This next week could be a really good thing for him, though, because if you look at the two cornerbacks on the outside for the Patriots that Cooper and Gallup are going to face, you could see, Cobb from the slot, get a lot of work, because you have to imagine that the Patriots, they love to take away the best weapon.
Yep.
Even if Amari Cooper's limited all week, I guarantee you the guy that they're going to say they're not going to let beat him will be Amari Cooper.
Oh, yeah. And then those other guys will run wild. How about in Pittsburgh? And I shout out to our Twitter followers who follow the show at FF Hustle or you or I.
Hey, great. One last thing on Cobb. Sorry.
Please.
The thing that's crazy with him this year, especially over the last several weeks, is his average depth of target. If you look at the way he was used, even the way Cole Beasley was used before in the Dallas offense, but this offense, not only is it moving faster, but they're pushing the ball vertically down the field. Listen, his average depth of target over the last 2 weeks, 15.4 and 14.3.
Wow.
Randall Cobb never
I
got
thought it
that
would be
kind of
like
work.
7.
Yeah, exactly. And he still had games like that. But right now on the season, he's at an 11. That's a career high for Randall Cobb.
Interesting. Like I was saying, I had some of our great listeners hit me up on Twitter, and I try to get to all you guys when you're asking us start-sit questions or trade things. And I have my DM. You must not have your DMs open because I get them all, man. Every guy hits us up, but I don't mind. It's cool. And a guy said, give me a sleeper wide receiver for this week. Somebody asked who's a guy to trade for on the cheap, and I said Devontae Parker because he's like a top 15 wide receiver since week 6. And I said, you want a sleeper wide receiver for this week? Let's go to the Pittsburgh Steelers, James Washington. This is a guy we've talked about since a year ago, it seems, Dwayne. And Juju's banged up. We don't know if he's going to play. Deontay Johnson got the bejesus knocked out of him in their last game. We don't think he's going to play. They get the Bengals this week. He could be the only guy on the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, James Washington is he was in my article today at Establish the Run. 85% of the snaps, 92% of the routes per dropback, only 11% of the targets. But, he did play college football with Mason Rudolph. So James Washington and Vance McDonald could very likely be the top 2 targets, along with, I would say, Jalen Samuels. That could be your 3 top targets in the passing game this coming weekend, especially if Deontay Johnson. I mean, Juju's battling a concussion and a knee issue. So I think James Washington is a guy that between the 2 of those guys, if just one of them miss and the other one, if Juju tries to play through his knee, say he gets over the concussion, but is playing with a bad knee, you get a great matchup, against the Bengals. I don't expect there to have to be a ton of points. I expect Pittsburgh's defense to really take care of, Cincinnati with Ryan Finley playing quarterback. But you could easily come up, with a touchdown, reception, from James Washington, either down in the red zone or, just a big play, because we know that is his specialty.
Great DFS punt player right there. One more wide receiver group I want to talk about, and it's a guy that I was promoting in the offseason, and I was a big Kelvin Hardman fan, and we're going to talk about the Redskins here. So he's kind of on the upswing. We've got Terry McLaurin, who I begged people, if anybody out there is touting Terry McLaurin, unfollow them on Twitter. I get that it was a great matchup last week, but his quarterback is hot garbage. He's not ready to play. Let's look at Dwayne Haskins a year or 2 from now, and maybe the story's different. Graham Barfield put out a great stat. McLaurin is averaging almost 9 points a week less in a PPR with Haskins than Keenum. You can't play this guy. Trade him if you have a trade deadline this week. But anyways, Dwayne, let's talk about Kelvin Hardman, and then I want to get your thoughts on their backfield also.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is just another example of, and it's not that, Case Keenum was great or anything, but he was functional in the offense. It's just another example of what happens when your quarterback play goes downhill. What I will say about Haskins is he's actually improved each week. His average depth of target has gone from 3.6 to 6.8 to 7.1. According to Pro Football Focus, his adjusted completion percentage, which just means his on-target throws, 60%, 63%, 77%. So he's throwing the ball further down the field, and his completion percentage is going up. He's thrown an end zone throw in week 9, then he threw 2 throws into the end zone this past week in week 11. They had a bye week on week 10. So, I mean, the guy's actually, he's playing a little bit better. I'm not saying he's a guy that you want to rush out and start, but I think, Terry McLaurin, depending on your matchup, is still a guy, that and again, it depends on how deep your league is. But if you're in a 12-teamer and you got 3 receivers and 2 flex players, I mean, Terry McLaurin very well could be a guy, that you still are ending up with in your lineup, depending on the matchup. As far as Kelvin Hardman goes, 92% of the snaps. I wrote about him as a guy that we needed to monitor 2 weeks ago in the Establish the Run article. I actually left him in it last week because they were on bye. Then came out and ran a route on 93% of the dropbacks this past weekend and led the team in targets with 17%. This is a guy I know that you liked in the preseason, Drake.
Loved him at NC State. Kid was a monster.
Big-bodied receiver. His hands are pretty inconsistent. He traps the ball a lot. He does some things that I don't particularly, like, but he's functional. I mean, he makes it work for him. So he does have, some, skill to his game. He is a guy that Jay Moyer wrote about earlier in the preseason as well, about a guy that did some things similar to Larry Fitzgerald, not so much with his hands, but just little subtle things that he did to turn his body at the point of catching the ball to shield defenders from raking the ball away. And he's a possession type receiver, so he needs to be good at things like that. And he's getting his opportunity. So I think what we're seeing here, Drake, is this is a team that's not very good, and they want to see what they have in Kelvin Harmon. I think they know what a lot of these other guys are. So Terry McLaurin and Kelvin Harmon are their future. Let's see what they look like with the young quarterback. As far as the runners go.
Yes, because I wanted to mention this. If Geis is on your waiver wire, folks, maybe you want to add him. AP, 0 snaps in the fourth quarter, but there's another guy looming, and it makes no sense.
It's a pain in the butt. I mean, this is a terrible team. And so you don't want to own running backs on bad teams. We've talked about this. We talked about it in the preseason. That, is some of the advice that we've been giving for a long time. But guys played 31% of the snaps. Adrian Peterson played 26%. Wendell Smallwood played 43%. It's just so stupid.
9 fourth quarter snaps for Wendell Smallwood.
And that's game script. They lost the game by 10 points. You're down late. You're going to use your passing down back, and that's the thing that stinks. You would hope that Darius Guice could get some of that, and he's not. Mm-hmm. So now you're in a situation where you've got 3 guys with the role, and it's just a bad situation, Drake. 35% of the rushing attempts to Guice, 45% to Adrian Peterson. If you got to own somebody out of all of this, it is going to be Guice, but I just don't know. Like with Harmon and McLaurin, them being healthy, I have no doubt the Redskins are going to see what they have in them. With Guice, I just don't know. I mean, are they going to just go ahead and get what they can out of Peterson because they want to protect Guice's health because he's had so many issues?
Makes sense.
Or are they just going to put, the pedal to the metal with him as well and say, hey, let's see what this young runner has? That is a potential outcome. That could be one of the things that happen. Guice is most likely gone. We talked to people about picking him up, 2 weeks ago, whenever this news was, when we knew that he was going to be coming back. But if I had to pick between the 3, I'm still going to go, with the young guy. The problem you have is once Chris Thompson comes back, he'll just take Wendell Smallwood's spot, and he'll be the guy running all of those routes. At the same time. Jeez. Oh, maybe that'll be awesome. I don't really want to own any of this, but if I had to pick, it would still be Guice.
A lot of guys in skank leagues out there, man. You're starting Wendell Smallwood if you have to.
I feel like this is a skank season.
It really is. If you want to listen to smart guys talk fantasy football and you enjoy what Dwayne does, go check out the RSP Film and Data podcast he does with Mr. Jay Moyer. And Dwayne, you might say, how did Dwayne get that? He screwed it up for 6 weeks in a row. It's because I pulled it up on your Twitter feed, so I didn't.
I knew eventually
your show.
Before the season was over, you would get it right.
I would.
I have faith in you.
All right, let's quickly, before we get into tight ends, kind of run down. If these guys are on your waiver wire, this is who you're prioritizing this week. We didn't get into it much, but quarterback, look at the schedule Baker Mayfield has coming up. I'm not saying he's great. I'm not saying he's efficient because he's neither of those things. But his schedule coming up is Miami, then at Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, at Arizona, and then Baltimore. 3 of those 5 games, he is totally in play. All right? Maybe you want to mix in somebody else with him. How about Jacoby Brissett? He's at Houston this week, who gives up the farm to quarterbacks. I think Lamar Jackson's still scoring points on him. Then he goes and gets Tennessee at home. And then, oh, by the way, he plays at the Bucs. Another guy, if you're desperate out there, Sam Darnold. I don't trust him at all. But Oakland at Cincinnati, and then against the Dolphins. And how about our old pal, Big Dick Nick? I'm staring at I have a Sports Illustrated framed right across from me here, the Philly special. Listen to this schedule for a quarterback. At Tennessee, home for Tampa, home for the Chargers, at the Raiders, at the Falcons. You could do worse than old BDN.
Yeah, by which week is Minshew starting again?
We'll see. I don't know. If you need some defenses out there, how about Atlanta, Dwayne? This is a team that hasn't given up a defensive touchdown in 2 weeks, and they have 11 sacks over those 2 games. This team was a dumpster fire up until 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Beating New Orleans,
beating New Orleans and Carolina.
Yeah, it's wild. The Browns get the Dolphins.
You get Tampa, then you got to deal with New Orleans on week 13, and you got Carolina week 14. But yeah, I mean, Tampa Bay next week, you could get you a pick 6 out of that.
Yep. If you're just looking at this week, the Browns get the Dolphins, Lions at Redskins, the Packers, although they got the 49ers this week. Looking ahead, they get the Giants, Redskins in 13-14.
And the Bears.
Yep. And the Eagles, we mentioned, have a great schedule upcoming too. So check those guys out. Also, I don't know if we mentioned that, Jalen Samuels, if he's on your waiver wire, like, go get him, of course. So let's switch over to tight end now. And Dallas Goedert played 80% of the snaps, Dwayne, a lot of them out of the slot. Overall in the season, he's tight end 9, and he has the 8th most targets. Like, I picked him up and flexed him in a league.
Yeah.
They're so beat up. You got to play this guy. They have nobody else.
Yeah, that's what you talked about a few weeks ago. They've just really moved to playing more of the 12 personnel. You know, that's their base offense now. And I think it's working, you know, to an extent well for them. It didn't end up, you know, panning out right for them this past weekend. But Ertz and Goddard are both really good players. So 89% and 81% of the snaps between the two of them this week. Then 90% and 73% were their routes per drop back. The thing with Goddard is, I mean, he's slowly been on a trend up now for like 5 weeks, Drake. I mean, snaps have gone from 58 to 75 to 79 to 81. And then if you look at his routes per drop back, you know, the same type of thing. You know, you've seen him jump up from I lost my spot. You see him jumped up from 42% to 55% to 64% to 73% routes per drop back for Goddard. So now, to your point, there were several guys hurt. Alshon Jeffrey, obviously Deshaun Jackson's been hurt all season, but Alshon Jeffrey wasn't able to play with an ankle. So Nelson Aguilar and Jordan Matthews were your 2 starting receivers. They saw 20 and 18% of the targets.
What year is this?
I don't know. But Goddard, saw 15% of the targets. You know, he's got
preseason week 4.
He's got 5 targets in the end zone this year. That's 23%. That's good for second on the team, whereas Zach Ertz only has 1. But Ertz, if you are an Ertz owner, you do have to feel good. 28% and 28% of the targets each of the last 2 weeks. So he is definitely back in as, you know, we talked about this a few weeks back. Hey, how these cycles come and go as far as what defenses are going to focus on based on what they're seeing over the last 3 or 4 weeks on film. And Zach Ertz is doing a nice job here over the last couple of weeks for his fantasy owners as far as receptions.
Same game, opposite team. How about Hollister? Jacob Hollister is a player for the Seattle Seahawks. I would have no problem picking him up and starting him for the remainder of the season.
Yeah, and we talked to people about picking him up last week. I've got in a really big league where I'm going to be in the chase for the big money. I've got to use Jacob Hollister this weekend for Hunter Henry, and I've got an option where I could put OJ Howard in. Heck no, I'm putting in Jacob Hollister all the way. Yeah,
I was going to mention him. Now OJ Howard it was a weird play. The ball was kind of behind him, and it got pinned to his back and flipped up and was intercepted. He basically didn't play after that. Cam Drake comes in, goes 10 for 76 on 14 targets. The OJ Howard experiment is over.
Yeah, just trade him. If I'm in a dynasty league, I'm buying OJ Howard shares all day. He just needs to go to a different team. We've seen what the guy can do in the 2 previous years until he got hurt. When you give this guy targets, you get this guy involved in your offense, and you figure it out as a coach. This is a guy that can win games for you. You know, he's just a player that's having a rough spell as far as he's had some unfortunate things happen. But as far as fantasy goes, I don't know if it'll stick heading into next week or if it was just hopefully they were hoping to just get OJ Howard's attention. But Brate played 75% of the snaps versus 24% for Howard. 81% routes per drop back, 19% for Howard, which the week before was the opposite. OJ Howard played 99% and Brate only played 18%. Ran a route on 75% of dropbacks. His routes per drop back the week before were only 11% for Brate. So it was finally like, OJ Howard's finally breaking out, and now it just flip-flops back the other way. And Brate, though, he saw by far the biggest target share for tight ends for the season. So go figure, right? The week they finally use tight ends is the week whenever they get OJ Howard out of the game, and they go to Cameron Brate 25% of the time. So I don't know that I trust it, Drake. It's going to be tough. We could very easily see OJ Howard go back to being in the lead role or them splitting it come next week. Plus, you got Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, who are still going to be
Scotty Miller now popping up here, getting some run.
But again, what had we seen several weeks before? You got to watch this kind of stuff. So you had seen Mike Evans have 30, 28, and 36% of the targets. So what's on film? That. Then the last 2 weeks, 13% and 16%. Why? Because teams took it away. So what's going to happen? Give it another week. Mike Evans will be the guy coming back. So it's interesting how this stuff works. We've been talking about it for 2 years.
To quote friend of the show, Joe Dolan, Bruce Arians was sick of it. If you're looking for a deep tight end, and I know there's some guys in our chat room here, thanks for hanging with us, guys, looking for a few. How about former Family Guy cast member Ryan Griffin for the Jets? This was supposed to be the Chris Herndon role, but Ryan Griffin is taking it and running with it. He, caught 5 of his 5 targets for 109 yards and a touchdown this past week. Guy just doesn't seem to go away.
No, and Herndon's out now. But if you look at the last several weeks, here are your Ryan Griffin PPR points: 12, 1, 23, 11, 1, and 22. So yeah, there's some stinkers in there. One of those weeks with a 1 was the week that Herndon was back. And so if you look at just the last 3 games where Herndon, really wasn't a factor, 23 PPR, 11 PPR, and 22 PPR points. Yeah. So Ryan Griffin right now is a guy that I would feel very comfortable plugging into my lineup if I needed to. Sam Darnold is kind of turning into Kirk Cousins. He's the guy that likes to work that inside interior part of the field, Drake. He likes his tight ends. He likes his slot receivers. Look at Jamison Crowder, 27% of the targets last week. He's got 23%, leading the team on the year. We might have a new Kirk Cousins in the league.
And he did that last year. Remember how much he loved Quincy Enunwa out of the slot last year? He was killing it.
Yep.
We just need him coming off here with you like that kind of thing. A good meme from him. A couple other guys you might need to pick up at tight end. David Njoku is looking to come back. Remember this guy? He returns for the Browns this week. And how about Noah Fant, Dwayne?
Talked about him on the last RSP, film and data podcast.
You almost screwed it up. I
did. I was just trying to make you feel better. I
had to pull the damn thing up. Noah Fant, he's legit the number 2 option in that offense now. And he's getting balls. So if you need a guy, there's Noah Fant, what can you do?
Since Emmanuel Sanders has been gone, Noah Fant, 20% of the targets and 23% of the targets. And then they had a bye week sandwiched in there. He's led the team in targets one of those 2 games. You still got Cortland Sutton, another name on the Denver Broncos. And this didn't even go in the article. This is for podcast listeners only. Another deep skank name, Drake. Tim Patrick.
There it is.
83% of the routes per drop back. This was a guy we know that they liked. And Deshaun Hamilton is really just more of a slot guy, but he saw 21% of the targets. And this is a guy that can work down the field. Again, you're not excited about this offense. And if you're in a super deep league, Tim Patrick is a guy that looks like he's going to be getting some more work.
He is the embodiment of that Undertaker meme from Twitter where the coffin's closed and he comes up and he sits up out of it. He was pulled off the field they carted him off. He sat on the cart and they pulled his ass to the locker room and the guy comes in, he's making one-handed catches later in the game. So kudos to you, Mr. Patrick. If you're looking for a kicker this week, we do talk a little kicker here. Jake Elliott, a good schedule coming up. Nick Folk for the Patriots. Made 3 of them this week against the Eagles. Gets some really nice matchups with the Cowboys, Texans, and Chiefs. Young Ho Koo. I don't know. I was going to mess that up, but he gets Tampa Bay, the Saints, and Tampa Bay his next 3 games. And then you had to deal with a San Francisco kicker debacle because Robbie Gould got hurt, and I know you have him on a lot of your high-stakes teams, pal. So how about McLaughlin here? He's kind of okay.
Yeah, I guess. You talk kickers, not me.
Yeah, well,
I got another tight end
out there.
Just real quick on Miami, Gesicki, 86% of the snaps this last week, Drake, ran a route on 92% of the dropbacks. So just, again, Dolphins, everybody being out. And Gesicki saw 13% of the targets, but that's his highest routes per dropback rate, and that's his highest percentage of snaps all season long. So Gesicki's one other name at tight end.
Wow. Here, just before we get out of here, Dwayne, I never usually do this, but we got a guy in the chat room asking a question. Start one of these running backs. We'll assume it's half-point PPR. Royce Freeman, Rex Burkhead. This is a skank league. Holy shit. So Freeman, Burkhead, Scarborough, Jonathan Williams.
So Royce Freeman is playing Buffalo, and then you've got goodness gracious, Burkhead is playing Dallas.
We're trying to help you here, Chris.
You got Scarborough playing Washington, and then you've got Jonathan Williams playing Houston. I think I'm going with Scarborough because I expect Detroit to win the game. I like the matchup against the Redskins as far as a run defense. That's who I would go with. It is a tough decision. I would watch the news. What could tilt me to Jonathan Williams is if for some reason Jordan Wilkins is still having an ankle issue and we're not going to see Jordan Wilkins on the field for some reason this next weekend, that would swing me to Jonathan Williams. But otherwise, I would go Scarborough.
There you go. He is Dwain McFarland of EstablishTheRun.com. You can also see his great work over at MattWaldmanRSP.com and FootballGuys.com. Check out his podcast he does with Jay Moyer. Follow him on Twitter at Dwain McFarland. Anything else you need to push out there, my friend?
No, man, we covered a lot of good stuff. If you own Sony Michel, I'm sorry. I'll just say
thanks.
that.
Dick.
Yeah, that's it. It sucks. If you own Alvin Kamara, everything's back to normal. 29% of the targets. Trying to think, who else did we not talk about that I didn't even say anything about in the article early? Todd Gurley, 76% of the snaps, 74% of the rushing attempts, 63% routes per dropback, 17% of the targets, Drake. So
Todd Malcolm
Gurley,
Brown for when his knee falls off.
Yeah, 22 PPR points for Todd Gurley. How about that,
Crazy.
Drake? Darrell Henderson was deceased. Gerald Everett played through injury but didn't play much. LaShawn McCoy and Darrell Williams, with Damian Williams out, it was slightly Darrell Williams saw more of the carries. LaShawn McCoy saw more of the targets. So again, it's just, this thing's just a mess. It's a committee. And if Damian Williams doesn't play, you're probably going to see Darwin Thompson active. Any others? I highlight a few guys for the show. Oh, TJ Hawkinson. I will say, his routes per dropback they've been creeping up. 48%, 56%, and 68%. You need Matt Stafford back because, it's just a struggle right now. But that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting trend. We'll see if that holds. We already talked about Odell Beckham Jr., DJ Moore over the last 3 weeks straight, 28%, 26%, 30% of the targets. So they're going to be watching that film. Where are we going? It's going to be Curtis Samuel time. It's going to be coming. It's going to be coming this next week, Drake. We've talked about Devin Singletary in the past. But, man, just continues. 73% of the snaps this weekend, Drake. 61% of the routes per dropback. So Singletary hasn't really popped since really taking this role over. He was honestly doing more as a backup. His time is coming. Singletary is going to have a big week here, eventually. They do play Denver this week. It's not like the best matchup in the world. He's due for a big play. Dawson Knox for the second week out of the last three, Drake. Has been over 60% routes per dropback and over 70% of the snaps. So there's a few more for people.
Let me get last thing out here for the 11 people still listening to the show. Brian Hill was the big pickup last week and crapped the bed. Any thoughts on that?
It was all performance based. So, we'll see what happened. His snaps, 60%, rushing attempts, 58% were fine. Routes per dropback, almost 50%, all solid numbers. So, it's something where I would want to see it again. With that kind of volume, I don't mind playing him now that, the Falcons offense is playing better. Tampa Bay is not a great matchup for running backs, but he could squeak one into the end zone.
There you go. All right. I hope you join us, folks, over at Fantasy Draft. Use promo code FFHustle. We'd love to show those folks how active and engaged our audience is. I know you'll come through for us. So Fantasy Draft code FFHustle. I am at Drake Fantasy. He is Dwain McFarland. We will see you guys next week on an all-new edition of the Fantasy Football Hustle. Good luck in Week 12, folks.